It's unlikely you see code in black and white, and I mean that literally. A designer and a developer uses syntax highlighting to visually differentiate portions of her code. But these different kinds of signifiers aren't something we interpret consciously. They're typographic cues that augment the conventions of a programming language. You, the developer, are reading and skimming code, and how effectively you're able to do this is informed by many of the same principles that determine how effectively you're able to read anything else. Syntax highlighting is designed, and its success is determined in part by the typography. Just like in any discipline, specific typography, there are certain considerations that need to be made that are unique to the subject matter, but many principles are generally applicable. Because of this, typographic conventions in syntax highlighting can teach us about setting type in other situations, longer form articles, visual identities, user interfaces, and other things entirely. When syntax highlighting is successful, we don't stop to appreciate it, and this is a good thing. We shouldn't have to. But it's something I'd like us to dedicate some time toward today. Our work uses type extensively, and it's something you probably know more about than you realize, and some advanced typographic features you might know more about than you realize directly through your familiarity with typographic conventions in code. Syntax highlighting creates a visual hierarchy, and just as they do in graphic design, Gestalt principles help us explain how you interpret the code that you're reading. Similarity through color is what we think of when we think of syntax highlighting. It's categorized for us with different hues. It helps you immediately associate pieces of code and know they're similar and dissimilar, but this is just one piece of how syntaxes are highlighted, how typographic principles are used within our code. Various graphic design instructors have reminded me over time, if it's the same, make it the same, and if it's different, make it different. Color is far from the only method we have to associate or disassociate syntaxes visually. Type style, typeface weight, and background color are just a few that we see in our code editors. For example, with this piece of CSS, we can see sort of headers established just by bolding the class names. And we can notice a typo more quickly when a background color is used on this piece of CSS, which immediately bumps it up in the visual hierarchy of the document. It's a lot faster than running the tests and finding it out later. There are conventions in syntax highlighting, and just like when you're setting type in an article, for example, a subheader, it can be set in many different ways. These conventions can be followed, ignored, or intentionally broken to various effect. Perhaps comments are the best example of this. How they are set can place them anywhere in the hierarchy of the document, and there's sort of a philosophy that goes along with this. Comments can be subtle, encouraging you to focus on the code, or they can become the most prominent piece of your text editor, demanding to be read. Here they are side by side, the same CSS, but with a very different visual hierarchy, and this plays a role when you're documenting code for other people as well. Continuity and symmetry are two other principles that tell us how aligning alike elements and other contextual features can help you keep your place while writing code. Highlighting one bracket and having the corresponding one matched is one of my favorites. You highlight one tag and you know your place because the other one is matched as well. And if you're using a whitespace significant preprocessor or language, maybe you're using SAS, CoffeeScript, something like that, there are considerations for you as well, of course. You can see whitespace characters shown, or lines or rules can appear to help guide your eye vertically. Familiarity also plays a role in syntax highlighting, and by maintaining the same syntax highlighting for an extended period of time, you may actually find it easier to read. Certainly it has some influence on how you read. When speaking about typefaces themselves, type designer Zuzana Lichko famously said, "Readers read best what they read most." And while this has more to do with why blackletter, the type style most commonly used in the first Western books, printed with movable type, looks challenging to read to us today, but was once the norm, on a much smaller level, I think it also suggests how familiar we are with our code editor typeface, and our syntax highlighting has some influence on how we interpret it. And this might be challenging to measure the real impact of. There's so many factors that influence our productivity while we're programming. But you can just imagine what it would be like if each time you opened your text editor, a completely different syntax highlighting theme was loaded as an extreme example of the possible alternative. Familiarity influences our perception of code when it's displayed elsewhere too. Consider these two pieces of documentation. Both are familiar, but for very different reasons. On a first glance, which are you more likely to trust? One common graphic design tool that is noticeably absent from this list is size. Size can very clearly establish a visual hierarchy. In book typography, this is often done through a type scale, but within our code editors, most of us would feel very strange if there was some sort of change in size within our code as we were writing it. Monospaced typefaces lose their benefit for us when writing code when we change the size, so we change the size of everything at once. It isn't used to differentiate content for us. And I think this is an opportunity for us to learn about typography elsewhere. Syntax highlighting cues developers on what they're about to read without ever involving type size. Your familiarity with typography within code means you already have some knowledge of how to communicate different kinds of content within text. And this is useful because whatever kind of project you are working on, it involves syntax highlighting beyond code. Color and other forms of visual emphasis have long been used within written and typographic communications. Showing relationships is relevant to many kinds of writing and text, and one that we're quite familiar with is link text. Sir Tim Berners-Lee distinct blue hyperlink signifies that this text is different than the rest around it. These words are different, it says. You can interact with them, and color has long been used to emphasize content. This is a reproduction of an Erhard Ratdoit page from the 15th century, which uses color in line for emphasis. What about the beginning and the end of a sentence? Punctuation wasn't always used to do this. Marcin Rickery from Medium has said reading was hard work, so hard indeed that one would usually read out loud, and only in that way realize where to pause, where to breathe, and where to stop. And we can see that reflected in older books that would have been hand-lettered by scribes just a few decades earlier, but are now manually rubricated or illuminated by them later. They've gone back through a mechanically printed book and marked out where the pauses should be. I see this now as a bit like reading minified HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We don't really need to do it anymore. It's not what we're used to. It's not the convention. But we can also see where this came from, and we can do it if we need to. To jump much further forward, even the contemporary idea of a type family is something that's quite new. Peter Bielak says, thanks to Frutiger, it is now common practice to produce a dozen or more styles when working on a new type family. Very sadly, Adrian Frutiger passed away last year, but his typeface, Univers, in the 1960s was an early multi-axis typeface that used a system of weights and widths, design inspired by the periodic table. And this is reflected in a later project of Peter Bielak's, Greta Sans, which uses many weights and widths to create a comprehensive type family. And this is something that's become more and more common. It's the norm for type designers now to use interpolation to find where their typefaces exist within extremes. Something Tim and our keynote speaker Rachel mentioned yesterday is that you can't animate the CSS font family property. And what would it mean to have an animated typeface? But I'd like to suggest that actually typefaces are animated the whole time they're in development. They're certainly in transition. It's only later on that we lock them into a certain instance and decide that this is how it's going to remain. So yeah, you can see here, this is a type design project that I'm working on, and there are extreme weights that are being designed as the masters, and then the instances are the final outputted fonts. In addition to a variety of styles, many comprehensive contemporary typefaces include advanced typographic features that allow us to suggest different content, syntax highlight for our readers in specific situations. These advanced typographic features have been included and improved within fonts for years, and they are now viable to use on the web. Just as we differentiate content using bold, italic, anchors, and other visual cues, we can signify different kinds of content using advanced typographic features to readers using CSS. And for designers, I think the quintessential example of this is kerning, but I'd like to suggest that it's actually the spacing in general that's more important. Here we have the words variable and visible close up. There's a larger gap between the V and the A pair. And what's happened is each glyph already has a box with a certain amount of spacing allocated on either side of it. Those are called the side bearings. If we wanted to correct the side bearing on the right side of the V and reduce it, we would create issues elsewhere. The V and the I would collide. So this is the situation where kerning pairs become valuable. We can correct spacing issues in very specific situations, like the VA pair here. In our CSS, you might in the past see people recommend using text rendering optimized legibility. This is out of date. The browser default now should be font kerning auto, and it should already be turned on for you. But if you want to be explicit about it, you can use the font kerning normal property. It's important to remember that kerning isn't the goal. That's just how it's been implemented. What we're trying to do is correct the optical space between letters when we do this. The initial spacing in the typeface establishes the spacing. The kerning improves the spacing. Ligatures can actually also improve spacing as well, which is not something they're always thought for. Here we have an F and an I pair. The F is feels like it's going to collide in into the dot of the I, which is called the tittle. These can be resolved through a ligature rather than some other consideration. Ligatures can bring things closer together, they can move them further apart, but often their goal is to resolve these spacing issues close up. You can use those in your CSS with the font variant ligatures and property and setting it to common ligatures. The underlying technology that defines how this works is called OpenType, and it actually just turned 20 years old a couple of weeks ago. The specification details which of these features should be on by default or not. So this one should actually already be turned on by default. And as we all know, there are never any points of confusion with how CSS works across browsers. So I'll just move on. Discretionary ligatures are an extension of this. They're appropriately named because they're available to be used at your discretion. I sort of think of them like the syntax highlighting we used for errors. You have a background color that immediately raises the visual hierarchy, something in the visual hierarchy of the document. So they might not be appropriate to use everywhere, but they're kind of fancy, or an additional consideration that might be appropriate for a headline, something like that, something where you want to grab people's attention, probably not in line in text where it might be something distracting. You can use this font variant ligatures property and set it to discretionary ligatures instead of common ligatures. A really nice use of this is Louder Than 10's website. Their magazine Cokes uses discretionary ligatures in the headlines. Another feature I wanted to tell you about are contextual alternates. These are really interesting because they can give typefaces advanced features that help disguise that they're fonts. This is Lavanderia by James T. Edmondson, available through the Lost Type Co-op. If you look at the A at the end of the word there, the tail can actually be swapped out for a contextual alternate that gives it a flourish. This has more to do with traditional hand lettering or references, the tools that James was thinking about when he was designing the typeface, and makes it feel less like a font and more like a piece of human lettering. Various typefaces take advantage of this feature in many different ways, but in this case, the typeface becomes more script-like and less like a font. Another one of my favorite examples of this is Shiva Nalaparamal's typeface Enemy. You can see close up here that this typeface is a stencil, but what Shiva has cleverly done is swap out the when there's two O's, two K's, two E's, the O's and the K's and the E's are each different. So there's very subtle variations in the letters here. So you never see the same letter twice in a row. This helps it more feel like a realistic stencil and less like a font where the letter is the same each time. To use this in your CSS with typefaces that support it, you can use font variant ligatures. Contextual, this again should be on by default. We'll come back to some of the browser-specific issues for that. I also wanted to talk briefly about some language-specific considerations. In Dutch, for example, certain situations require IJ to be treated as a single letter, whereas in English and some other languages, they're treated separately. Ligatures can help with that. Kimya Gandhi also wrote a recent piece for alphabetes.org about a Devanagari typeface she designed with many contextual alternates. These are challenges that I personally am not an expert in, but I'm really interested in seeing what type designers and the typographers who use their typefaces bring to the web when we think about these advanced fonts that are maybe being used in print, and now that we're seeing these advanced features supported on the web, what it could mean for typographers who are setting many languages. And that one feature I did want to tell you more about as well is stylistic alternates. We're looking at the typeface Lavanderia again. This phrase open type features I've set again with completely different open type features. This is the same typeface twice, but by enabling different open type features, we can get a very different character from it. So the first example has titling alternates and stylistic alternates, and the second one has contextual and stylistic alternates and swashes. James Edmondson says Lavanderia's stylistic alternates provide simpler forms for the lowercase b, h, f, l, and k. This is different for each typeface, but it allows designers to specify an extra set of glyphs that can be swapped out. Proxima Nova, for example, is a very common and very popular typeface on the web, but it actually has a stylistic set that you can swap out a few glyphs and give it quite a different character. And I think this is one way where you can use a typeface that might feel old or overused otherwise and give it a different take. We try to highlight some of these open type features on the Lost Type website. I worked specifically on the feature tester for the type tester for the Lost Type website. Here you can test all the different open type features in Lavanderia. They're parsed out client side of the web font file and then highlighted as you type, so you can see all the possibilities within this font. This is something we're hoping to do more with in the future, but really we would just like to see all these features within fonts taken advantage of more. So far, we've been using the font variant ligatures property, but to use stylistic alternates, it actually requires the higher level font feature settings property. Font variant ligatures is a lower level property, kind of like margin bottom. You can set margin bottom 1em, or you can set margin 001em0. So font feature settings is the higher level property that lets you specify multiple open type features at once. So in this case, we'll specify contextual alternates, which are shortened to CAlt, and we'll also specify stylistic alternates, which are shortened to SAlt or SALT. This next one is shortened to case-sensitive forms. I think this is one that's become increasingly relevant because we keep putting different things in front of words that people didn't expect we would do that to before. So whether it's hashtags or handles with @ symbols. If you change this into a headline and you want to set it in all caps, all of a sudden that @ symbol sort of looks like it's falling off the beginning of the word. But type designers will sometimes include a case-sensitive form, which will resolve that issue visually there and will make it more appropriate for headline settings. When you have headlines that are in all caps and you want to take advantage of, or you want to mitigate some issues that might come up by having dynamic content in there, this can be a really useful property. So to enable that one, you can use font feature settings and set it to case. And in this case, I'm also using text transform uppercase. I'll come back to some of the CSS specifics again. Another consideration that's related to uppercase and lowercase letters are small capitals. A way we can syntax highlight content for our readers is often to use small capitals for abbreviations. So here we're saying we're at the Front Trends headquarters, and you can see here I put markers to show where the X height of the letters are, the height of the lowercase letters. The small caps let you use a smaller version of capitals that are optically correct, that are more in line with the lowercase letters. When you're using this in a block of text, when you're reading, sometimes your eye moves forward and backwards, and it's possible for it to get pulled away if there's an uppercase set of pairs in the middle of a passage. By using small capitals instead, they're more in line with the lowercase letters, and you're less likely to get distracted in that manner. I think it's also important to remember that no small capitals is better than faux small capitals, which is about as close as we're going to get to a catchy rhyming takeaway from this talk, so hold on to that tightly. Small capitals, we see here first, small capitals, the real ones are shown second, and then third are fake small capitals, where I've actually just scaled down the uppercase letters to the size of the lowercase letters. And that means they're not going to be the same optical weight. They're going to really stick out more, and they're going to do the opposite of what you really wanted to accomplish. This is an example from Matthew Butterick's excellent book, Practical Typography. He says, don't click on the small caps formatting box in your word processor ever, and don't use the CSS property font variant small caps ever. These options do not produce small caps. They produce inferior counterfeits. And you can see here the first line, witness protection, the weight distribution is totally off. The W and the P look heavier, and then everything is much more even in the second example that says witness protection. So I bring this up because there is a CSS property that's been around a lot longer that's called font variant small caps, but we don't want to use that anymore. This is equivalent to loading a web font and then italicizing something when you don't have the italic version. It creates a fake version that looks very strange. Instead, you want to use font variant caps, small caps. I know that is such a small distinction. Don't use font variant small caps. You can use font variant caps, small caps. That's confusing. We'll come back to that as well. We use this on the search.sh website using true small caps for abbreviation to sort of syntax highlight those for our readers. HTTPS is an abbreviation. But we don't have to go through and put those all into our markup. Tools like typographic.js can apply those spans for you client-side in Node.js, or we actually run it within a static site generator. So I've got some markdown here with some abbreviations in it, and that's going to have the classes applied automatically. So I can get the benefits of using this within CSS without having to go through a huge headache of including it in the markup. He's still just talking about letters, you might say at this point. Figures. Okay, let's talk about numbers. See, that joke would have killed at a typography event because numbers can also be called figures. Yeah, let's keep going. Old style numbers and lining numbers. Old style lining numbers, which I'm showing here, are meant to be used alongside uppercase letters. They're great for headings, and they're more commonly used in sans serif typefaces. Serif typefaces usually have the old style numbers as the default, which are more intended to be used alongside lowercase letters. I think one of the best examples of this is Georgia versus Verdana, both designed by Matthew Carter. Verdana has lining numbers by default, which are more appropriate for the uppercase settings you might be using it for, or the other data you might use to set it. Georgia gets old style numbers by default, which is more appropriate if you're going to set a whole body of a bunch of body copy. They'll sit alongside the lowercase letters better than lining numbers would. Newer typefaces will often include both sets, and you can choose which one you want to use, but they tend to include a default that is appropriate for the kind of information that typeface is intended to be used for. I also wanted to talk about proportional and tabular numbers. Stephanie Hobson recently got me thinking about this after her excellent talk, Flipping Tables, at Vancouver Styling Class Meetup. She recommended that you use a monospace typeface when you're setting tabular numbers to make the data easier to compare. And we can see here that if you're trying to read these numbers vertically, they don't all properly line up. Switching this to a monospace typeface would solve that. But we don't actually need to do that because a lot of typefaces already include a set of tabular numbers which are monospaced. They all vertically align. This also preserves the X height, which means that when you're reading things horizontally and vertically, things are preserved. So this is, I think, a particularly useful one for user interface design when you're setting numbers and you want to show things in columns. This is a small change that can have large improvement for how your readers and users read tables. I saw an example of this on the plane here. It also applies to animation when you're not just stacking columns, you're stacking frames, and in this case, the numbers are shifting width each time they change. Yeah, so obviously you can have the window seat next to me if we're on a plane because I'm going to be thinking about proportional versus tabular numbers. This was resolved by the time I got to the airport, or at least the airport did it better, so here's an example of the alternative. You can use this in your CSS with font variant numeric, tabular nums. I see people taking pictures. I'm hopefully going to show you something that will mean you don't need to reference those pictures towards the end of this. So to go through what it means to actually use this in your web pages and in your applications, you need to choose a typeface that actually includes tabular numbers, load the web font with the tabular numbers still included, and then enable these features we've been talking about. So first, choose the typeface. This is challenging, but looking for these features can actually help you decide what you need to be looking for. Remember, typefaces are different. Not all of them will include tabular numbers. This is Morriston by Riley Cran. It includes a set of tabular numbers. It's a sans serif typeface, and it does a good job of displaying data. This is another typeface by the same designer, Riley Cran, Escafina, but it's a script typeface. It does not work in setting this table like this. It's intended for big display sizes like this. It works great for headlines, but not for tables, so it doesn't have tabular numbers. So the first thing you need to do is think about what that typeface is intended to display. If it's for information, it will probably have the feature like this that you're looking for. Next, you need to load in the web font with the features still included. If you're using a web font service, sometimes that just means checking a box in the settings. And if you're self-hosting, it just means not subsetting out those features when you do it. I'll link to the documentation for each web font service in the transcript of this talk because it just differs a little bit from each one, but usually it's just ticking a box in the settings. Finally, you want to enable the tabular numbers open type feature within your CSS. So this is what we've been looking at, font variant numeric, tabular nums. This actually technically only works in Firefox 34 and higher right now. So we want to use font feature settings, which has much better browser support with a higher level property. But this has some other issues because if you've specified different instances of font feature settings throughout your application, they can override each other. This breaks the cascade if you have any of these features elsewhere. So what I've been using to get around this are CSS feature queries. They're like media queries, but we can check if certain properties are supported. So in this case, we're saying if it supports not, if it doesn't support font variant numeric tabular numbers, then use font feature settings tabular tnum. Otherwise, use font variant numeric tabular numbers. I don't see CSS feature queries used as much as I kind of would have expected. They're quite well supported now, but I suppose it depends on which property you're looking for. In this case, they are supported very well alongside the font feature settings property, so they work great for determining whether or not you can use it. I would understand, though, if you said you're not going to do all that to get these advanced typographic features into your CSS. And I feel the same way. I don't want to figure that out every time as well. So I've gone through the browser support issues and put it into a single library called utility OpenType. It's a very lightweight CSS library that has simple CSS utility classes for advanced typographic features. All the CSS I've shown you will work, but this gives you the best browser support possible, and designers and developers can use it through class names alone. You can see it at utilityopentype.kennethormandy.com. You can install it through, You can install it through NPM. It works within Sass and PostCSS, or you can just include the CSS file into your build process. And then what you'll be able to do is use those 4-letter shorthand versions as class names in your markup. So here we've got a table with the tnum class, and then later we have an abbreviation with the small caps class. This is all documented with lots of examples on the site. But what I really felt was more important was that you know about where you might want to apply these typographic features, not just that they existed at all. Developers have frequently demystified their craft for me, including the people who I've been privileged enough to share the stage with here at Front Trends. I hope you can see that typography can be demystified as well. Yes, you want to develop your eye, but you can also research and get excited about these advanced typographic features as a way to find out more about typography. You know more about typography than you give yourself credit for, directly through your familiarity with syntax highlighting and typographic conventions in code. Because of this, when you design for readers, you'll syntax highlight everything. Thanks.